a lonely rancher took in a hurt native child. The next morning, his ranch was surrounded by armed riders in ritual silence. The silence was absolute. No wind stirred the sagebrush, no birds called from the cottonwoods along the creek, and even the cattle had stopped their morning lowing. Samuel Crawford stood on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon him from every direction. Somewhere in the shadows that surrounded his Montana ranch, riders sat motionless on their horses, neither threatening nor retreating. They had been there since before sunrise, a ghostly circle of judgment waiting for him to explain why a 12-year-old crow boy lay sleeping in his spare bedroom with a bullet wound in his shoulder. Samuel had built his life on the principle of minding his own business. At 45, he owned 3,000 acres of prime grazing land in the Yellowstone River Valley, where he raised some of the finest cattle in Montana Territory. His ranch house was modest but comfortable, built from local stone and timber with wide porches that offered views of the surrounding prairie and the distant peaks of the Absaroka Mountains. He employed no permanent hands, preferring to hire seasonal help when needed and handle most of the work himself. The isolation suited Samuel perfectly. He had come west after the war between the states, carrying wounds both visible and hidden that made human company difficult to bear. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw told part of the story, but the deeper scars were the ones that had driven him to seek solitude among the endless grasslands where a man could work in peace and think his own thoughts without interference. His relationship with the local Crow tribe had been cordial, but distant. Samuel understood that his ranch sat on land that had been tribal territory for generations, and he tried to show appropriate respect for that history. He allowed tribal members to cross his property when traveling traditional routes, and he had occasionally provided food or shelter during harsh weather. In return, the Crow had left his cattle alone and generally treated him as a neighbor rather than an intruder. The events that led to this morning of silent judgment had begun the previous afternoon, when Samuel was checking his fence line near the eastern boundary of his property. The sound of gunshots echoing across the prairie was not unusual in itself, but something about the rapid succession of shots suggested trouble rather than hunting. Samuel had ridden toward the sound, following a game trail that led through a grove of cottonwoods toward the river. He found the aftermath of what appeared to be an ambush. 3 horses lay dead in the tall grass, and scattered around them were the belongings of travelers who had been set upon by superior numbers. Most disturbing were the tracks that suggested at least one person had been taken alive, dragged away from the scene toward the rough country to the north. Samuel was examining the tracks when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Somewhere in the brush along the riverbank, someone was crying with the desperate, exhausted sobs of a child in mortal terror. Moving carefully through the undergrowth, Samuel found him hiding beneath the overhanging roots of a massive cottonwood tree. The boy appeared to be about 12 years old, with the distinctive features and traditional clothing that identified him as Crow. His buckskin shirt was soaked with blood from a bullet wound in his left shoulder, and his dark eyes held the hollow look of someone who had witnessed horrors beyond his comprehension. When he saw Samuel approaching, he tried to scramble deeper into his hiding place, but his injured arm made movement difficult. "Easy, son," Samuel said softly, stopping several feet away and raising his hands to show they were empty. "I am not going to hurt you." The boy spoke rapidly in Crow, his voice high with fear and pain. Samuel did not understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. The child was terrified and probably expecting to be killed by this white stranger who had discovered his hiding place. "Do you speak English?" Samuel asked gently. The boy nodded hesitantly. "Little bit," he whispered. "What is your name?" "Joseph," the boy replied, using the English name that had probably been given to him by missionaries. "Joseph stands tall. That is a good, strong name. I am Samuel Crawford. Can you tell me what happened here?" Joseph's eyes filled with fresh tears as he struggled to find the English words to describe his ordeal. "Bad men came. They killed my uncle and cousin. They took my sister away on horses. I tried to stop them, but they shot me." Samuel felt a familiar rage building in his chest. He had seen enough of war and violence to recognize the aftermath of a deliberate attack on innocents. The dead horses and scattered belongings suggested that this had been a planned ambush, not a chance encounter between travelers and hostiles. "How long ago did this happen?" Samuel asked. "Yesterday morning," Joseph replied. I have been hiding here since then." Samuel could see that the boy was in serious condition. The bullet wound in his shoulder was still bleeding slowly, and his face showed the gray pallor of someone who had lost significant blood. More importantly, infection was already setting in, as evidenced by the fever that made his eyes bright and unfocused. "Joseph, I need to get you to my ranch so I can treat that wound," Samuel said. "Will you let me help you?" The boy looked at Samuel with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "Why would you help me? You are white man." "Because you are hurt and you need help," Samuel replied simply. "And because what happened to your family was wrong, no matter who did it." Something in Samuel's tone must have convinced Joseph, because he allowed the rancher to help him out of his hiding place and onto the horse for the ride back to the ranch. The boy was clearly in considerable pain, but he bore it without complaint, gripping the saddle horn with his good hand, while Samuel led the horse at a careful pace. Back at the ranch house, Samuel carried Joseph inside and settled him on the bed in the spare room. The boy's wound was worse than it had appeared at first glance, with the bullet still lodged deep in the shoulder muscle. Samuel had enough medical knowledge from his army days to know that the projectile would have to be removed before infection could be controlled. "This is going to hurt," Samuel warned, as he prepared his instruments by the light of several oil lamps. "But if I do not get that bullet out, you could lose your arm or worse." Joseph nodded bravely, though Samuel could see the fear in his young eyes. "Do what you must. I will not cry out." The surgery was one of the most difficult things Samuel had ever attempted. Working by lamplight with improvised tools, he carefully probed the wound until he located the bullet and managed to extract it without causing additional damage. Joseph bore the procedure with remarkable courage, gripping the wooden bit Samuel had given him, but never making a sound that might indicate weakness. When the operation was complete, Samuel cleaned the wound thoroughly and applied a poultice made from medicinal plants that his Crow neighbors had taught him to use for healing. He then bandaged the shoulder carefully and gave Joseph laudanum for the pain that would follow. "You did well, son," Samuel said as he covered the exhausted boy with warm blankets. "Get some rest now. You are safe here." Joseph looked up at Samuel with gratitude that seemed far too mature for someone his age. "You are a good man, Samuel Crawford. I will not forget this kindness." As the boy drifted off to sleep under the influence of the pain medication, Samuel sat in a chair beside the bed and considered what he had gotten himself into. Harboring a wounded Crow child was bound to attract attention from various quarters, and not all of that attention would be friendly. The territorial authorities would want to know why he had not immediately reported the incident, while the perpetrators of the attack might come looking for any witnesses who had escaped their initial assault. But Samuel had made his choice the moment he decided to help Joseph, and he was not a man who second-guessed his decisions once they were made. The boy needed medical care and protection, and Samuel was in a position to provide both. Everything else could be sorted out later. The night passed quietly, with Samuel checking on Joseph regularly to monitor his condition and adjust his medication as needed. The boy's fever remained high but stable, and the wound showed no immediate signs of worsening infection. By morning, Samuel was cautiously optimistic that his young patient would recover fully given time and proper care. It was as he stepped onto his porch to check the weather that Samuel first became aware of the silent watchers. The sensation was subtle at first, just an odd feeling that something was different about the usual morning sounds and rhythms of his ranch. But as the light grew stronger and his eyes adjusted to the growing dawn, he began to make out shapes in the landscape that should not have been there. They sat motionless on their horses, positioned at regular intervals around the perimeter of his property. Samuel counted at least 20 riders, all armed, and all maintaining the absolute silence that suggested this was a formal occasion governed by strict protocol. They were close enough to be clearly visible, but far enough away to avoid any appearance of immediate threat. Samuel recognized the leader immediately. Chief White Wolf was a man of perhaps 50 years, distinguished by his bearing and the eagle feathers that marked his status within the Crow Nation. Samuel had met him several times during his years in the territory, and he knew the chief to be both wise and formidable. White Wolf sat his horse with the patience of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary for satisfaction. Understanding that he was expected to make the first move, Samuel walked slowly across his yard toward the nearest group of riders. He kept his hands visible and his movements deliberate, showing respect for the gravity of the situation, while demonstrating that he had nothing to hide. "Chief White Wolf," Samuel called out when he was within speaking distance. "You honor my ranch with your presence." White Wolf studied Samuel's face for a long moment before responding. "Samuel Crawford, we have come to ask you about the boy." "Joseph is safe," Samuel replied. "He was badly wounded, but he will recover." "You removed a bullet from his shoulder," White Wolf said. It was not a question, but a statement that indicated the chief knew exactly what had transpired in Samuel's house during the night. "Yes, the wound required immediate attention to prevent infection." White Wolf nodded slowly. "And the men who shot him? What do you know of them?" Samuel described what he had found at the ambush site, including the evidence that suggested the attackers had taken at least one prisoner. As he spoke, he could see the controlled anger in White Wolf's eyes, though the chief's expression remained carefully neutral. "They took his sister, Singing Bird," White Wolf said when Samuel finished his account. "She is only 14 years old and very beautiful. We know what such men want with young girls." Samuel felt his own anger rising at the implication. How many were there? "Joseph says 6 men, well armed and mounted on good horses. They knew the country and had planned this attack carefully." "Do you know who they were?" White Wolf's expression grew grim. "We have our suspicions. There are men who operate from the mining camps to the north, criminals who prey on isolated travelers. They sell captives to the brothels in the lawless towns, or keep them for their own use." Samuel had heard rumors of such activities, but had never encountered them directly. The thought of a 14-year-old girl in the hands of such men made his blood boil with righteous fury. "What do you intend to do?" Samuel asked. "Find them," White Wolf replied simply. "Rescue Singing Bird if she still lives. Bring justice to those who attacked our people." Samuel looked around at the circle of silent warriors, understanding now why they had come. This was not just about retrieving Joseph or investigating a crime. This was about honor, justice, and the protection of the innocent. The Crow had come to take the measure of the white man who had aided their child, to determine whether he was an ally or merely a bystander in their quest for justice. "I want to help," Samuel said, the words coming out before he had fully considered their implications. White Wolf raised an eyebrow. "This is not your fight, Samuel Crawford. You have already done much by saving Joseph's life." "It became my fight the moment I found that boy bleeding in the brush," Samuel replied firmly. "What was done to your people was an act of evil that no decent person can ignore." The chief studied Samuel's face for several minutes, perhaps trying to read the sincerity of his offer. Finally, he dismounted from his horse and walked over to where Samuel stood. "You understand what you are proposing?" White Wolf asked quietly. "These are dangerous men who will not hesitate to kill anyone who stands in their way. And if we are successful in our mission, there will be consequences. The territorial authorities will not look kindly on a white man who rides with Crow warriors against other whites, regardless of their crimes." Samuel thought about his comfortable, solitary life on the ranch and all the complications that would come from involving himself in this conflict. Then he thought about Joseph's courage during the surgery, and about a 14-year-old girl in the hands of men who would use her in ways too horrible to contemplate. "I understand," Samuel said, "but some things are more important than personal safety or social approval. Justice is one of them." White Wolf smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "Spoken like a true warrior." "Very well, Samuel Crawford. You may ride with us, but know that once you cross this line, there is no going back. You will be marked as a friend of the Crow people, with all the benefits and dangers that such friendship entails." "I am honored to accept that friendship," Samuel replied. The war party that assembled that morning numbered 30 warriors, all experienced fighters who understood the seriousness of their mission. Samuel was equipped with weapons and supplies by his new allies, and he found himself impressed by their organization and discipline. These were not the savage raiders that frontier newspapers often described, but professional soldiers preparing for a military operation. The trail left by the kidnappers was easy to follow for the first day, leading north through rough country toward the mining camps that dotted the mountainous region beyond the Yellowstone Valley. But as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the tracks became more difficult to read, and it became clear that their quarry was skilled at concealing their movements. It was Joseph who provided the key information that allowed them to close the gap. Despite his injury, the boy had insisted on joining the pursuit. and his intimate knowledge of the country proved invaluable. He was able to identify landmarks and shortcuts that allowed the war party to anticipate their prey's movements rather than simply following their trail. "They are heading for Devil's Canyon," Joseph said on the second day, pointing toward a narrow gap in the distant mountains. "There is an old mining camp there that was abandoned years ago. It would be a good place to hide captives." White Wolf nodded approvingly. "The boy thinks like a warrior. We will get ahead of them and set an ambush." The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Half the war party would continue following the obvious trail, driving the kidnappers toward the canyon where they believed they would find safety. The other half, including Samuel and Joseph, would circle around through more difficult terrain to reach the abandoned camp first and set up positions to prevent escape. Samuel found himself assigned to the advance party, perhaps because White Wolf wanted to test his commitment under difficult conditions. The ride through the mountains was grueling, requiring them to navigate steep slopes and rocky passages that tested both their horsemanship and their endurance. But Samuel kept up without complaint, earning nods of approval from his crow companions. They reached the abandoned mining camp just as the sun was setting on the third day. The place was a collection of ramshackle buildings clustered around the mouth of a played-out gold mine, with a single narrow trail leading in and out of the canyon. It was indeed a perfect hideout for men who wanted to avoid unwanted attention. Smoke rising from one of the buildings confirmed that the camp was currently occupied, and careful observation revealed that there were indeed 6 men present, along with what appeared to be a female captive being held in a separate building under guard. The rescue would have to be carefully planned to avoid risking harm to Singing Bird during the fighting. The attack came at dawn, when the kidnappers were least alert and most vulnerable to surprise. Samuel found himself positioned to block the only escape route, his rifle trained on the trail, while Crow warriors moved silently through the camp to neutralize the guards and secure the prisoner. The fighting was brief but intense. The kidnappers, caught completely off guard, managed to get off only a few shots before they were overwhelmed by superior numbers and tactical skill. When it was over, 3 of the criminals were dead, and the other 3 were prisoners, while Singing Bird was safely in the arms of her relieved family. Samuel had fired only 2 shots during the engagement, but both had found their marks when kidnappers tried to flee down the trail he was guarding. It was his first taste of combat since the war, and he was surprised to find that his old skills returned easily when protecting the innocent required their use. The journey back to Crow territory was a triumphant procession, with Singing Bird reunited with her brother and the criminals who had terrorized the region finally brought to justice. Samuel rode beside White Wolf, and he could feel that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with both the chief and the broader Crow community. "You fought well," White Wolf said, as they made camp on the final night of their journey. "Joseph was right to trust you, and I was right to accept you as an ally." "What happens now?" Samuel asked. "To the prisoners, I mean. They will face tribal justice for their crimes," White Wolf replied. "Their victims will decide their fate according to our customs and traditions." Samuel nodded, understanding that he had crossed a line into a world governed by different rules than those of white civilization. But he felt no regret about his choices, only satisfaction that justice had been served and innocent lives had been saved. When they finally reached Samuel's ranch, the entire Crow community was waiting to welcome them home. The silent circle of judgment had been replaced by a celebration of victory and the safe return of their children. Samuel found himself embraced by people who now considered him family, an honor he had never expected to receive. "What will you do now?" Joseph asked as Samuel prepared to return to his normal routine. The boy's shoulder was healing well and he would carry no permanent damage from his ordeal. "I suppose I will go back to raising cattle," Samuel replied. "But I suspect my life will be somewhat different than it was before." "How so?" Samuel looked around at the Crow families gathered in his yard, at the children playing games while their parents shared food and stories. His isolated ranch had become a meeting place, a bridge between 2 worlds that had found common ground in their shared values of courage and justice. "I do not think I will be quite so lonely anymore," Samuel said with a smile. Joseph grinned and threw his good arm around Samuel's waist. "You are part of our family now. Crow families take care of each other." As the celebration continued into the night, Samuel reflected on the extraordinary week that had transformed his solitary existence into something rich with purpose and connection. He had thought he wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his cattle and his memories, but Joseph's courage and White Wolf's wisdom had shown him that isolation was not the same as peace. The lonely rancher who had once sought only to mind his own business had discovered that sometimes the most important business was standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. In taking in a hurt native child, he had found not just a friend, but an entire community that valued honor, loyalty, and the protection of the innocent. The silence that had surrounded his ranch that morning had been the silence of judgment, but it had become the silence of acceptance and belonging. Samuel Crawford was no longer just a white rancher living on Crow land. He was a member of the Crow Nation, with all the responsibilities and privileges that such membership entailed. And as he watched Joseph laughing with his sister beside the campfire, Samuel knew that he had made the right choice. Some things were indeed worth fighting for, and the smile on a child's face was among the most precious of them all.